The world is in a period of huge flux, and while that can be quite dark and unsettling, there is also a huge opportunity, particularly for Europe, to chart a very different course in economics and more widely in our politics to provide the answers that people are really looking for. It's really important that we make these changes to our economic system to answer the demands that people have, because we see that if reasonable answers aren't provided, then people will go looking to the far right, who are making gains in many countries around Europe and around the world. And this is largely driven by the fact that our economies have stopped delivering for people. They drive massive inequality. People's lives are very hard in terms of making ends meet. And at the same time, we saw in the pandemic, at that point of huge difficulty for so many people around the world, death and despair, actually the very wealthy, those with huge assets, prospered. Asset prices went up. There's something fundamentally wrong with this system, and it needs reform. It needs more than reform. It needs transformation. I think it's interesting to consider, when did the system stop working? And it's hard to pinpoint, but we know that inequality, for example, was massively falling in most countries after the 1940s, until suddenly the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s sent it in the opposite direction. So for many people, that was when the system stopped working so well. Now, what I've seen in politics is that for a long time that was masked by the growing economy. So although the gap was getting bigger, for example, between executive pay and the average person's pay, nonetheless, people felt their lives were getting a bit better. What changed when we had the massive financial crash in 2008 and then the huge austerity that followed that was that people saw their local services struggling. They couldn't get a doctor's appointment. They were concerned about local schools, transport investment ground to a halt in many places. They were finding it harder to make ends meet. And yet they then saw that inequality. They realised that that system wasn't working for them. So I think it's not worked for quite a long time, but for many years that was hidden, and now it is laid bare. We saw that with the financial crash. We saw that with the pandemic. And I think the crises that are hitting in an increasing and accelerating way are just all the time going to bring that into even sharper relief. What we see is our political system also trying and struggling to deal with that. But effectively, as long as it is bound into the confines of the current economic system, politics can't deal with it. That's why we see in many countries that big old traditional parties have collapsed. In France, obviously, we saw that when Macron was elected. In the UK, we now see the Conservative Party having its worst result effectively in its history. And the right is fragmenting in so many places. But we've also seen the left not really have the answers, because it is perhaps the last defender of the status quo. And so something has to give. Our politics is requiring that, is driving towards that. And there's obviously a pathway which takes us in a very, very dark direction towards authoritarian ethno-nationalism. But there is a better pathway, and that's the kind of new economic thinking that here in Berlin we've been discussing. And indeed, there is so much energy right across Europe and right across the world for people thinking about different ways of economics. I would also say that in Europe, we shouldn't necessarily assume that, we've got the best thinking. There's many parts of the world where they have always thought differently about economics, where the assumptions about the way in which people exchange goods and services and our relationship to each other and to the natural world just comes from a different set of assumptions and beliefs, that mindset. So you've got East and West, where you have the collective and the individual focus. We've got a lot to learn from the Eastern way of thinking. In the pandemic, we saw we are interconnected, interdependent. You can't have health just for yourself and your family. Public health means that you have to invest in making sure the whole community, the whole society is healthy. And that's that challenge to that individualist structure that has been predominant within many parts of Europe and certainly the United States for many, many years. So yes, we need to think differently about economic policy, but we also need to think differently about the underlying mindsets, cultural beliefs that underpin that.